I reached for the small digital recorder on my desk, fingers trembling more than I'd like to admit. The cancer made everything shake these days. But this wasn't just the disease. After 67 years of keeping these secrets, I was finally going to tell the truth. The device clicked on with a soft beep. I cleared my throat and leaned back in my government-issued chair, surrounded by the sterile walls of my Washington, D.C. office. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that familiar bureaucratic glow I'd worked under for most of my adult life. Outside these walls, the country went about its business, completely unaware of what I was about to record. "My name is Robert Mitchell," I said into the recorder. "Today is November 15th, 2024, and I'm dying. The doctors give me maybe 2 weeks, 3 at the outside. Before I go, there are things that need to be said. Things the American people deserve to know." I paused, gathering my thoughts. Where to even begin? How do you explain decades of lies and cover-ups? How do you make someone understand the scope of what's been hidden from them? "Everyone remembers Watergate," I continued. "They think that was the big scandal, the moment when government corruption was finally exposed, Nixon resigning in disgrace, the system working the way it was supposed to. What a joke." My laugh came out as more of a wheeze. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career in the very system I was about to expose, rising through the ranks while carrying the weight of what I'd witnessed. Watergate was nothing, a third-rate burglary that got out of hand. But you know what it really was? It was cover. A convenient distraction while far worse things continued in the shadows. The government has always been brilliant at that. Give the public one scandal to chew on while the real horrors happen where no one's looking. I shifted in my chair, trying to find a position that didn't make my spine ache. The cancer had started in my lungs but spread everywhere now. Fitting, really. I'd been breathing their poison for decades. They perfected the art of controlled exposure. Released just enough truth to satisfy people's hunger for accountability, but never the whole story. Never the parts that would really matter. Feed them what they can handle. Make them feel like the system worked, like justice was served. Meanwhile, the machine keeps grinding. The recording device sat there, patient and unblinking, waiting for me to get to the real meat of it. I'd practiced this speech in my head countless times, but actually saying it out loud felt different. Heavier. "I need to go back to 1957, I said. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college in Iowa. Small-town kid with big dreams and a head full of theories about serving my country. I thought I knew what patriotism meant. I thought I understood the difference between right and wrong. The memories came flooding back as I spoke. That tiny apartment near campus, the stack of textbooks on my desk, the letter from my mother congratulating me on graduation. I'd been so young, so eager to make my mark on the world. The recruiters found me before I'd even started looking for work. 2 men in dark suits showed up at my door one morning, introduced themselves as representatives of a classified government program. They said my professors had recommended me based on my academic performance and psychological profile. Apparently, I fit exactly what they were looking for. I remembered how honored I'd felt. Out of all the graduates in my class, they'd chosen me. It seemed like validation of everything I'd worked for. They couldn't tell me much about the specifics, of course, national security and all that, but they painted a picture of cutting-edge research, the kind of work that would keep America ahead of the Soviets. They talked about working with the brightest minds in the country, solving problems that could determine the outcome of the Cold War. The pitch had been perfect, tailored exactly to what a young man like me would want to hear. They'd done their homework on my personality, my motivations, my deepest desires to contribute something meaningful to the world. The money was incredible, too. More than I could have made in 5 years of regular work. They'd provide housing, food, everything I needed. All I had to do was commit to an indefinite assignment at a secure facility. They made it sound like the opportunity of a lifetime. I'd said yes before they'd even finished explaining the terms. Looking back, that eagerness should have been a warning sign. They'd been counting on it. My parents were so proud. Their son, selected for important government work at such a young age. They couldn't know the details, but they understood I was serving my country in a vital capacity. I felt like I was living up to everything they'd raised me to be. The recruiters had been very specific about the timeline. No delays, no time to reconsider. Within a week of that first meeting, I was packed and ready to go. They told me to bring only essential personal items. Everything else would be provided. I packed a single suitcase with clothes, a few photographs, and some books I couldn't bear to leave behind. That was it. My entire life fit into one bag. The train station in Chicago had been bustling with travelers when I arrived. Business people, families, soldiers on leave. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that someone like me was walking among them, about to disappear into the government's secret world. I reported to Union Station on a Tuesday morning in June. The same recruiters were waiting for me, along with a few other young men who looked just as excited and nervous as I felt. We didn't talk much during the boarding process. Everything felt very official, very important. The train itself had been unremarkable from the outside, just another passenger car attached to a westbound route. But once we were seated, the recruiters had made it clear that this wasn't a typical journey. They said we were heading to a research facility in Nevada, somewhere in the desert where we could work without interference or security concerns. The trip would take 2 days, and once we arrived, we wouldn't be leaving for quite some time. Maybe months, maybe longer. It all depended on the project requirements. I'd spent those first hours staring out the window, watching the familiar landscapes of the Midwest roll past. Farmland and small towns, the America I'd grown up in. I felt like I was leaving my old life behind and stepping into something bigger, something that really mattered. The train pulled away from the platform that morning, carrying me toward what I believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. If I'd known what was really waiting for me in that desert facility, I would have jumped off at the first stop and run all the way back to Iowa. But I didn't know. None of us did. We just sat there in our seats, young and brilliant and completely naive, as the train carried us toward a nightmare that would destroy everything we thought we understood about our government, our country, and ourselves. The train's brakes squealed against the rails as we pulled into what barely qualified as a station. I pressed my face to the window, trying to get a better look at our destination. All I could see was a small wooden platform sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless desert scrub and mountains that looked like they'd been baked brown by decades of sun. One of the recruiters stood up and straightened his tie. "Gentlemen, we've arrived. Please gather your belongings and prepare to disembark." I grabbed my single suitcase and followed the other recruits toward the exit. There were 6 of us total, all roughly the same age, all carrying that same mix of excitement and nervousness that came with stepping into the unknown. Nobody talked much as we stepped off the train onto the sun-warmed platform. The heat hit me immediately, dry and intense, in a way that made my Iowa-raised skin feel like it was shrinking. 2 military jeeps waited for us, along with several soldiers in standard fatigues. The contrast was striking. Our recruiters in their crisp business suits looked completely out of place next to these desert-weathered men with their serious expressions and automatic rifles. "Load up," called one of the soldiers, a sergeant based on his stripes. "We've got a 40-minute drive ahead of us." I climbed into the back of the second jeep along with 2 other recruits. The guy next to me looked like he'd just stepped out of a library. Wire-rimmed glasses, carefully combed hair, and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He stuck out his hand as the Jeep lurched into motion. "Warren Peterson," he said. "University of Chicago, mathematics and physics." "Robert Mitchell, just finished at Iowa State, psychology and political science." The third recruit leaned over from his spot by the tailgate. "Teddy Hughes, MIT engineering. This is definitely not what I expected from the train schedule." Warren laughed, pushing his glasses up his nose as we bounced over what could generously be called a road. "I'm pretty sure we're not in Kansas anymore." "Iowa," I corrected. But I was grinning too. Something about these guys felt immediately comfortable, like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. The drive gave me plenty of time to study the landscape. Miles and miles of nothing but desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or rock formation. The mountains in the distance shimmered in the heat, and I couldn't see any signs of civilization beyond the dirt track we were following. Whatever this facility was, they'd chosen the perfect location if they wanted complete isolation. "Look ahead," Teddy said, pointing toward a break in the mountains. I followed his gaze and saw it, a complex of buildings nestled in a valley, surrounded by what looked like multiple layers of fencing. Even from a distance, I could make out guard towers and several larger structures that had the unmistakable look of military architecture. Clean lines, practical design, nothing wasted on aesthetics. As we got closer, the scale became more apparent. This wasn't just some small research outpost. The compound covered several acres, with at least a dozen major buildings connected by paved roads and walkways. Solar panels glinted on several rooftops, and I spotted what looked like radio towers and satellite dishes scattered throughout the complex. The main gate was impressive in its thoroughness. Multiple checkpoints, armed guards, and enough barbed wire to stop a small army. Our driver showed his identification to 3 different soldiers before we were finally waved through. I watched the massive steel gates swing shut behind us and felt a little flutter of something that might have been unease. Warren must have noticed my expression. Tight security for a research facility. "Well, we are dealing with classified material," I said, repeating what the recruiters had told us. "Can't be too careful during the Cold War." The Jeep pulled up in front of a long, low building that looked like standard military barracks. A few other recruits were already standing outside with their luggage, looking around with the same mix of curiosity and apprehension I felt. An officer approached our vehicle as we climbed out. "Welcome to Research Station Nevada 7, he announced. "I'm Major Harrison, Base Commander. You'll be staying in Building C for the duration of your assignment. Room assignments are posted inside, along with your orientation schedules and facility regulations." He gestured toward the barracks entrance. "Take the rest of today to get settled and familiarize yourselves with your immediate surroundings. Orientation begins at 800 tomorrow morning. Any questions?" Nobody spoke up. What could we ask? We still had no real idea what we'd be doing here, beyond the vague references to research and national security. "Excellent. Report to the main laboratory building tomorrow morning promptly. Your country appreciates your service." With that, Major Harrison walked away, leaving us to figure out the next steps on our own. I picked up my suitcase and headed inside with Warren and Teddy. The barracks were clean and functional, with long hallways lined with numbered doors. A bulletin board near the entrance held our room assignments, and I was pleased to discover that Warren and I had been placed in adjacent rooms, with Teddy just down the hall. My room was small but comfortable. Single bed, desk, dresser, and a small window that looked out toward the main laboratory complex. Everything was military-issue clean, with that distinct smell of industrial disinfectant and fresh paint. I unpacked my few belongings and tried to make the space feel a little more personal with the photographs I'd brought from home. That evening, Warren, Teddy, and I met up in the small recreation area at the end of our hallway. The room had a few chairs, a bookshelf filled with technical journals and novels, and a radio that picked up stations from Las Vegas when the atmospheric conditions were right. We spent hours talking about our backgrounds, our hopes for the assignment, and our theories about what kind of work we'd be doing. Warren had grown up in Chicago, the son of 2 university professors who'd encouraged his interest in mathematics from an early age. He'd already published 2 papers on theoretical physics before graduating, and spoke about complex equations the way other people talked about the weather. But he was also funny and self-deprecating, making jokes about his own intensity when he got excited about a problem. Teddy had a harder background, orphaned at 12 and raised by an uncle who worked in a factory. He'd earned his way through MIT on scholarships and part-time jobs, developing an engineer's practical approach to problem solving. There was something about his determination that reminded me of my own drive to succeed, and I could tell he'd had to fight for every opportunity. "So, what do you think they'll have us working on?" Warren asked, leaning back in his chair. "Weapon systems, probably," Teddy said. "Maybe radar or communications technology. Something the Soviets would love to get their hands on." I nodded. The recruiters mentioned staying ahead of the competition. Could be anything from missile guidance to code breaking. We spent another hour speculating before exhaustion caught up with us. The train journey and desert heat had taken their toll, and we all agreed that getting a good night's sleep was probably the best preparation for whatever tomorrow would bring. The next morning arrived with a wake-up call at 6:30. After a quick breakfast in the facility cafeteria, which served surprisingly good food for a military operation, we reported to the main laboratory building as instructed. The structure was larger up close than it had appeared from my window, with multiple wings and what looked like several basement levels. Major Harrison met us in a conference room along with Dr. Sarah Chen, a slight woman in her 40s, who introduced herself as the head of research operations. She had the focused intensity of someone completely absorbed in her work, and when she spoke about the facility's mission, her enthusiasm was obvious. "You've been selected for this program because of your exceptional analytical abilities," Dr. Chen explained. "Over the next several months, you'll be working on various projects related to national defense and technological advancement. Some of you will focus on weapons systems analysis, others on communications protocols or intelligence assessment." She handed out thick folders containing our individual assignments and security clearances. My folder indicated that I'd be working on psychological warfare techniques and intelligence evaluation, which seemed like a perfect match for my academic background. "The work you'll be doing here is vital to maintaining America's technological superiority," Dr. Chen continued. "The Soviet Union has made significant advances in recent years, and it's our job to ensure they don't gain a strategic advantage." Warren raised his hand. "Will we be working independently or as teams?" "Both. You'll have individual projects, but there will also be collaborative efforts where your different expertise areas complement each other." Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine that felt both challenging and rewarding. My days were filled with analyzing Soviet propaganda techniques, studying psychological profiles of foreign agents, and developing methods for improving the effectiveness of American intelligence operations. The work was exactly the kind of intellectual stimulation I'd hoped for, and I felt like I was making a real contribution to national security. Warren dove into communications encryption with the same intensity he'd brought to his college mathematics courses. His desk was constantly covered with pages of calculations and circuit diagrams, and he'd often work late into the evening on particularly complex problems. Teddy focused on weapons systems analysis, breaking down captured Soviet equipment to understand their technological capabilities. The 3 of us made a habit of eating meals together and spending our free time in the recreation areas scattered throughout the facility. There was a surprisingly well-equipped gym, a library that rivaled some universities, and even a small movie theater that showed the latest films from Hollywood. The food was excellent. The living quarters were comfortable, and the intellectual environment was everything the recruiters had promised. The other recruits seemed equally satisfied with their assignments. Everyone I talked to felt like they were engaged in meaningful work that justified the security restrictions and isolation. We couldn't leave the base or contact the outside world, but that seemed like a reasonable price to pay for the opportunity to work on such important projects. During our third week, Warren and I were walking back from the cafeteria when he brought up something that had been bothering him. "Don't you think it's a little strange that we haven't heard anything about how long this assignment will last?" I'd been wondering the same thing. They said it was indefinite when we signed up. Could be months, could be longer. But don't you think our families might be getting worried? My parents expected me to write once I got settled. That was true. I'd been so caught up in the excitement of the work that I hadn't really thought about my parents back in Iowa. They were probably wondering why they hadn't heard from me, but the security briefings had been very clear about maintaining operational secrecy. The major said contact with the outside world could compromise security, I said. "I'm sure they'll let us write letters once we've been here a while longer." Warren nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation. He had a naturally questioning mind that didn't accept easy answers, which made him excellent at his work, but sometimes difficult to reassure. By the end of our first month, any doubts about the assignment had faded into the background. The work was engaging. My friendship with Warren and Teddy had grown stronger, and I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. We'd been told we were part of something important, something that would help keep America safe during one of the most dangerous periods in its history. I went to sleep each night feeling proud of what I was accomplishing and excited about the challenges that tomorrow would bring. The isolation didn't bother me anymore. If anything, it made the work feel more significant. We were the select few, chosen for our abilities and trusted with the nation's most critical research. I had no idea that everything I believed about our purpose, our work, and our safety was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. I settled into the rhythm of life at the facility more easily than I'd expected. 3 months in, and the work still felt meaningful. The intellectual challenges kept me engaged, and my friendship with Warren and Teddy had become the foundation of my daily routine. We'd established our own little traditions: morning coffee in the cafeteria before heading to our respective labs, afternoon walks around the compound perimeter when the desert heat wasn't too brutal, and evening conversations in the recreation room about everything from quantum mechanics to baseball statistics. The isolation that had initially worried me now felt natural, almost protective. We were doing important work in a secure environment, and the outside world's problems seemed distant and irrelevant. My days were filled with psychological analyses of enemy propaganda techniques, and I genuinely believed I was contributing to something that would keep America safe. But sometime during that third month, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. It began with small observations that individually meant nothing but accumulated into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Recruits would be there one day and gone the next, their rooms emptied out and reassigned without ceremony. When I asked about them, the staff always had ready explanations: transferred to other facilities, assigned to field work, moved to specialized programs that required different security clearances. The first one I noticed was Danny Rodriguez, a chemistry graduate from California who'd been working on explosive compounds analysis. He'd seemed perfectly happy with his assignment, talking enthusiastically about his research just days before he vanished. I went looking for him one morning to discuss a paper I'd read about psychological triggers in chemical warfare, but his lab space had been stripped clean. Dr. Chen told me he'd been reassigned to a weapons testing facility in New Mexico, opportunity too good to pass up. 2 weeks later, It was Marcus Webb, the linguistics expert who'd been working on Soviet communication intercepts, then Sarah Kim, who'd been analyzing radar detection systems. Each time the explanation sounded reasonable on the surface: better opportunities, specialized assignments, family situations requiring relocation. But the pattern bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. Warren noticed it too, though he approached the puzzle with his mathematician's precision. He started keeping a mental list of who had disappeared and when, tracking the timing and frequency with the same intensity he brought to his encryption work. During our evening conversations, he'd mentioned details that seemed significant to him, but meant nothing to me. How certain recruits had been called for extra medical examinations before their disappearances, or how the explanations for their transfers never included specific facility names or contact information. "Don't you think it's odd that we never hear from any of them again?" Warren asked one night as we sat in the recreation room. Teddy was there too, working on a crossword puzzle while listening to our conversation. Danny promised to write me about his new research. Marcus said he'd send postcards from wherever they stationed him. Nothing. I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. Mail security, probably. If they're working on classified projects, they might not be allowed to correspond with former colleagues. "Maybe," Warren said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "It just seems like a lot of people getting transferred all at once." Teddy looked up from his puzzle. "How many are we talking about?" Warren counted on his fingers. 7 in the past month, out of maybe 30 total recruits. That number shocked me. I'd been aware of individual disappearances but hadn't realized the scope. Nearly a quarter of our group had vanished in just 4 weeks, and I'd been too absorbed in my own work to see the bigger picture. The conversation stuck with me as I went about my daily routines. I started paying closer attention to who was present at meals, who showed up for the optional evening activities, who occupied the neighboring rooms in our barracks. Warren was right. The numbers were significant, and the explanations were starting to feel rehearsed. Then Teddy mentioned feeling unwell. It was a Thursday morning in late September, and we were having our usual coffee before heading to work. Teddy looked tired with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that hadn't been there the day before. When I asked if he was okay, he shrugged and said he'd been having headaches and some stomach problems. "Probably just the stress catching up with me," he said, trying to smile. "Or maybe the cafeteria food finally got its revenge." Warren and I laughed, but I could see the concern in Warren's expression. Teddy was the healthiest person I knew, someone who never missed his morning exercise routine and rarely even caught colds. Seeing him look genuinely sick was unsettling in ways that went beyond normal friendship worry. By lunchtime, Teddy's condition had worsened visibly. He barely touched his food and excused himself early, saying he was going to lie down for a while. When he didn't show up for dinner, Warren and I went to check on him. We found him in his room, running a fever and complaining of severe nausea. "I think I need to see the medical staff," he said, his voice weak and shaky. "This isn't getting better on its own." Warren helped him gather a few personal items while I walked with them to the medical wing. Dr. Peterson, the facility's chief physician, examined Teddy briefly and decided to admit him for observation. They said it was probably a viral infection that needed monitoring. Nothing serious, but better to be cautious given our isolated environment. "I'll be back in a day or two," Teddy told us as they led him to one of the medical rooms. "Try not to have too much fun without me." That was the last time I saw him. Warren and I went to check on him the next morning, but the medical staff told us he was sleeping and couldn't have visitors. They said his condition was improving, but he needed rest. We tried again at lunch, then after work, but got the same response each time. By evening, I was getting frustrated with the restrictions. "He's our friend, not some classified project," I told the nurse on duty. "Can't we just look in on him for a minute?" She gave me that practiced smile I'd learned to recognize from the facility staff. "I understand your concern, but Dr. Peterson's orders are very specific. Mr. Hughes needs complete rest to recover properly." The next morning, Warren and I arrived at the medical wing, only to be told that Teddy had been transferred during the night. Dr. Chen met us in the lobby with another one of those reasonable explanations that left me feeling like I was being managed, rather than informed. "Mr. Hughes received word that his mother had been hospitalized," she said, consulting a folder that presumably contained the official story. "Given his family situation, we arranged for an emergency transfer so he could be with her during this difficult time." Warren and I looked at each other, and I could see my own confusion reflected in his expression. Something about this explanation felt wrong, but I couldn't immediately put my finger on what. "Will he be coming back?" I asked. "That depends on his family situation," Dr. Chen replied. "We certainly hope he'll be able to rejoin the program once things stabilize." We walked back to our barracks in silence, both of us processing what we'd been told. It wasn't until we were back in Warren's room that he voiced what I'd been thinking, but hadn't wanted to say. Teddy told us his parents were dead. The words hung in the air between us, like an accusation. I searched my memory, trying to recall the exact conversations we'd had about our families and backgrounds. Warren was right. Teddy had definitely said he was an orphan, raised by an uncle after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. "Maybe it was another relative," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "An aunt or grandmother." Warren shook his head. Dr. Chen specifically said his mother, and even if she meant some other family member, why wouldn't they let us say goodbye? Why transfer him in the middle of the night without any warning? The questions multiplied the more we thought about them. Why hadn't Teddy mentioned having family who might need him? Why had the medical staff been so restrictive about visits? Why did the transfer happen so suddenly? And why hadn't we been allowed to see him before he left? Warren became obsessed with finding answers. He started showing up late to his own work sessions because he'd been walking around the compound, looking for any trace of where Teddy might have gone. He checked with the motor pool to see if any vehicles had left during the night, questioned the radio operators about emergency communications, and tried to piece together a timeline of Teddy's disappearance. His investigations didn't turn up much concrete information, but they did reveal how tightly controlled information was at the facility. Nobody seemed to know anything about transfers or departures beyond their own specific responsibilities. The motor pool kept logs, but they were classified. The communications staff maintained records, but they weren't available for review. Every inquiry ran into security protocols that shut down further questions. 2 days after Teddy's disappearance, Warren made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been exploring areas of the facility that weren't directly related to our work assignments, looking for any clues about where missing recruits might have gone. Most of the buildings were secured with keypads or card readers that blocked access, but he'd found some storage areas in the basement levels that were only locked with standard keys. "I was checking out that storage room near the mechanical systems," he told me that evening, his voice low and urgent. "You know, the one where they keep the old office equipment and maintenance supplies." I nodded. I'd seen the room but never had any reason to go inside. "I was moving some boxes around, trying to see if there were any transfer records or shipping manifests that might mention where people get sent," Warren continued. "That's when I found something weird." He described how he'd been shifting a heavy filing cabinet to look behind it, when he noticed that the floor underneath looked different from the rest of the room. When he moved the cabinet completely out of the way, he discovered what appeared to be a trap door set into the concrete floor. "It's not on any of the facility maps we've seen," Warren said, "and it looks like it leads to another level below the basement, a level that officially doesn't exist." The implications of this discovery hit me immediately. If there was a hidden level beneath the facility, it might explain where the missing recruits were actually going. It might explain why the transfer stories never quite added up, why nobody ever heard from anyone who'd been reassigned. "Did you try to open it?" I asked. Warren shook his head. "The cabinet was too heavy to move by myself, and I didn't want to risk getting caught down there alone. But Robert, I think this might be connected to what happened to Teddy and the others." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us understanding that we'd reached a decision point. We could accept the official explanations, focus on our own work, and hope that our friend was safe wherever he'd been taken. Or we could investigate further and potentially discover something that the facility administration clearly didn't want us to know. The smart choice was obvious. We were surrounded by military security, working on classified projects, and bound by agreements that probably made unauthorized exploration a serious crime. Whatever was happening to the missing recruits, it was being handled by people with far more authority and resources than two junior researchers could challenge. But Teddy was our friend, and the lies about his family situation proved that we weren't getting the truth about his disappearance. If something had happened to him, if he was in trouble or danger, we owed it to him to find out. "We have to go down there," I said finally. Warren nodded grimly. "Tonight, after everyone's asleep." We spent the rest of the evening making plans and trying to act normal during dinner and our usual recreation time. I found it almost impossible to concentrate on casual conversation, knowing what we were planning to do. Every staff member who walked past felt like a potential threat. Every security guard seemed to be watching us more closely than usual. By 11 o'clock, the barracks had settled into its nightly quiet. Warren and I waited another hour to be certain that everyone was asleep, then crept out of our rooms and made our way through the darkened corridors toward the basement storage area. The facility felt different at night. Longer shadows, unfamiliar sounds from the mechanical systems, an overall sense of emptiness that made our footsteps seem louder than they should have been. We used Warren's small flashlight sparingly, just enough to navigate the stairs and hallways without running into anything. The storage room was exactly as Warren had described, cluttered with old furniture, boxes of outdated equipment, and the general accumulation of things that nobody quite knew what to do with. The filing cabinet stood in the center of the room, moved aside to reveal the trapdoor underneath. Looking at it up close, I could see that this wasn't some improvised modification. The trapdoor was professionally installed, with heavy-duty hinges and what looked like a sophisticated locking mechanism. Whatever lay beneath us was meant to be permanent and secure. Warren grabbed one side of the handle while I took the other. The door was heavier than expected, but it opened smoothly and silently on well-oiled hinges. Below us, a set of metal stairs descended into darkness that our flashlight couldn't penetrate. I could smell something coming up from the lower level, a mixture of chemical odors and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just another office or storage area. Warren looked at me, and I could see my own fear and determination reflected in his expression. We'd come this far, and turning back now would mean never knowing what had happened to Teddy and the others. We started down the stairs, leaving the familiar world of the facility behind and descending into whatever secrets lay hidden beneath Research Station Nevada 7. I followed Warren down the metal stairs, each step taking us deeper into a world that shouldn't have existed. The chemical smell grew stronger as we descended, mixing with something else that made my throat close up. It was organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. The stairs ended at a concrete corridor that stretched away into darkness. Our flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom, but I could make out doorways lining both sides of the hallway. The ceiling was lower here, maybe 7 feet high, and lined with pipes and electrical conduits that hummed with some kind of power I couldn't identify. Warren moved ahead of me, his flashlight sweeping back and forth across the corridor walls. The concrete was stained with dark patches that could have been water damage, but something about the patterns made my skin crawl. They looked too deliberate, too purposeful. We passed the first door on our left. Warren tried the handle, but it was locked. Same with the second door and the third. Each one was heavy steel with a small window set at eye level, but the glass was too dark to see through. Whatever lay behind these doors, it wasn't meant for casual observation. The air got thicker as we moved deeper into the corridor. I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the worst of the smell, but that just made me taste it instead. Sweet and metallic, with an underlying current of decay that reminded me of the dead animals I'd sometimes found around my family's farm back in Iowa. Warren stopped abruptly, and I nearly walked into him. He was standing in front of a door that looked different from the others. This one had a larger window, and light was coming through it. Not bright, but enough to see by. Warren switched off his flashlight and pressed his face to the glass. His sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was in there, it was bad. I moved up beside him and looked through the window into what had to be the largest room in this underground complex. Laboratory equipment filled the space. Centrifuges, microscopes, computer terminals, and machinery I couldn't identify. Banks of fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh white illumination. But it wasn't the equipment that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. Tables filled the center of the room, and they were covered with human body parts. Arms, legs, torsos, heads, all arranged with the clinical precision of a medical examination. Some were fresh enough that I could see muscle tissue and exposed bone. Others floated in glass containers filled with clear fluid, suspended like specimens in a museum. My brain tried to reject what I was looking at. This had to be some kind of medical training facility, maybe for combat surgeons who needed to practice on realistic models. But the more I stared, the more obvious it became that these weren't models or training aids. They were real. A movement in the far corner of the lab caught my attention. Something large was working at one of the tables, bent over what looked like a partially assembled torso. At first glance, it appeared to be a person in a bulky hazmat suit, but as I watched, I realized the proportions were all wrong. The thing straightened up, and I saw what we'd found. It had been human once, maybe several humans. The basic shape was there: head, torso, arms, legs. But everything was wrong. Extra limbs had been attached to the sides of its chest, giving it 4 arms that moved independently. Its legs were different lengths, one clearly from a much taller person than the other. The head was the worst part, a patchwork of different facial features that didn't belong together. 2 scientists in full hazmat suits stood nearby, watching the creature work and occasionally making notes on clipboards. They moved around it like it was perfectly normal, just another piece of laboratory equipment. Warren made a choking sound beside me, and I felt my own stomach lurch. The thing at the table was holding a human hand, examining it with the same clinical detachment I'd seen in anatomy classes, but this hand still had a gold ring on one finger, and the skin tone was too fresh, too real. That's when I saw the arm. It was lying on a table closer to our window, severed at the shoulder and elbow. The skin was pale, with dark hair on the forearm, and just below the wrist was a distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. I'd seen that birthmark dozens of times over the past 3 months. Teddy had always been self-conscious about it, usually wearing long sleeves even in the desert heat. He joked that it looked like someone had branded him as a kid. Warren saw it at the same moment I did. He made a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and stumbled backward from the window. The movement was too sudden, too panicked. His shoulder hit the corridor wall and he doubled over as his stomach finally rebelled against what we'd discovered. The sound of him retching echoed through the corridor, loud enough to carry into the laboratory beyond. The creature's head snapped up immediately, multiple eyes of different colors turning toward our window. Brown, blue, green. They didn't match, didn't belong in the same face, but they all focused on us with an intelligence that was somehow worse than mindless hunger would have been. It knew we were there. The thing began moving toward the door, its mismatched legs creating an uneven, lurching gait that carried it faster than should have been possible. Behind it, the scientists looked up from their work, and I could see them reaching for something that might have been an alarm. Warren was still heaving, but I grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. "We have to go. Now." He nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His face was white, and I could see the same terror in his eyes that I felt clawing at my own chest. We ran. The corridor had never seemed so long, stretching endlessly ahead of us as our footsteps bounced off the concrete walls. Behind us, I could hear a heavy door opening, followed by the irregular thump of the creature's footsteps as it entered the hallway. Warren stumbled, his legs still shaky from what he'd seen, but he kept moving. The chemical smell seemed stronger now, or maybe I was just breathing harder. Each step brought us closer to the stairs, closer to the world above where things made sense and people stayed in one piece. The footsteps behind us were getting closer. The stairs seemed impossibly far away as we ran through the corridor, our breathing harsh and ragged in the confined space. Warren was just ahead of me, his footsteps uneven but determined. Behind us, the creature's irregular gait created a rhythm that didn't belong to anything human. Thump, drag, getting closer with each passing second. My lungs burned from the chemical-tainted air, and sweat stung my eyes as I pushed myself harder than I'd ever moved in my life. The concrete walls blurred past us, each doorway we passed feeling like another opportunity for something else to emerge and block our escape. Warren reached the base of the stairs first, but his momentum carried him too fast up the first few steps. His foot caught the edge of the third stair, and I watched in horror as his ankle twisted at an impossible angle. He went down hard, crying out in pain as his body crumpled against the metal steps. "Warren!" I skidded to a stop beside him, grabbing his arm to help him back up. He tried to put weight on his injured foot and immediately collapsed again, his face contorting with agony. "I can't," he gasped, clutching his ankle. "It's broken or sprained or something. Robert, you have to." The creature rounded the corner behind us. Up close, it was even more nightmarish than it had appeared through the laboratory window. The patchwork of human parts had been sewn together with visible sutures, creating seams across its skin where different flesh tones met. Its multiple arms moved independently, reaching for us with fingers that belonged to different people entirely. Warren saw it coming and made one last desperate attempt to climb the stairs, but his injured ankle gave out completely. The thing was on him before either of us could react. Multiple hands grabbed Warren from different angles, one at his shoulder, another around his waist, a third closing around his throat. The creature's strength was inhuman, lifting Warren off the stairs like he weighed nothing at all. His feet kicked frantically, but they found no purchase against the smooth concrete walls. "Run!" Warren screamed, his voice strangled but clear. "Robert, get out of here. Save yourself." The creature began dragging him back toward the laboratory, and I stood frozen on the stairs, torn between the instinct to help my friend and the knowledge that I couldn't fight this thing. Warren looked at me one last time, his eyes wide with terror and something else. A desperate plea for me to escape and somehow make this right. I ran. My feet clanged against the metal stairs as I took them 3 at a time, Warren's screams echoing behind me until they were cut off by the sound of a heavy door slamming. The trapdoor was still open when I reached the storage room, and I hauled myself through it with shaking hands. The filing cabinet took everything I had to move back into position. My muscles strained against its weight, adrenaline making me stronger than I should have been, but also making my hands shake so badly I could barely grip the metal edges. Finally, it scraped back over the trapdoor, hiding the entrance as if it had never been disturbed. I stood there gasping, trying to convince myself that what had just happened was some kind of nightmare. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in my room and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe Teddy was fine, transferred somewhere safe, and Warren was sleeping peacefully in his bed down the hall. The storage room door burst open. 3 security guards in full tactical gear flooded into the space, automatic weapons trained on me. Behind them came 2 men in suits who looked like the recruiters who had brought us to this place, though their expressions held none of the friendly professionalism I remembered. "Robert Mitchell," one of them said, consulting a clipboard. "You're coming with us." They didn't give me a chance to speak, to explain, to lie about what I'd been doing. Rough hands grabbed my arms and zip-tied my wrists behind my back. A black hood went over my head, cutting off my vision and muffling the sounds around me. I felt myself being lifted and carried. Then the sensation of movement, corridors, stairs, the brief touch of outside air, then more hallways. When they finally stopped and removed the hood, I was in a small concrete room with no windows and a single metal door. The interrogation began immediately. They never told me their names or who they worked for. One was tall and thin with graying hair. The other shorter and younger, with cold blue eyes that never seemed to blink. They took turns asking questions, sometimes working together, sometimes leaving me alone for hours before returning to start again. "What did you see in the basement, Robert? Why were you in that storage room? Have you told anyone else about your little exploration? Who else knows about what you found?" I stuck to the same story from the beginning, even as the questions became more aggressive and the methods more persuasive. I told them I'd gotten lost looking for a bathroom, that I'd wandered into the storage room by accident, that I hadn't seen anything unusual or significant. They didn't believe me. The first day was just questions, but by the second day, they'd moved to more direct methods of encouragement. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, temperature extremes, nothing that would leave permanent marks, but everything designed to break down my resistance and make me tell them what they wanted to hear. I thought about Warren constantly during those long hours. Was he dead? Had they turned him into another one of those things, adding his parts to some new creation? The not knowing was almost worse than the physical discomfort of the interrogation. By the third day, I was barely coherent. They'd kept me awake for over 60 hours, subjected me to temperature swings that left me alternately shivering and sweating, and used techniques I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. But I held onto my story about looking for a bathroom, about not seeing anything important, about being just a confused young man who'd made a wrong turn. The truth was too big, too horrible to share with these people. If I told them what I'd really seen, what had happened to Teddy and Warren, they'd know I was a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. As long as they thought I was just an innocent who'd stumbled into the wrong place, there was a chance they might let me live. On the fourth day, everything changed. The interrogators didn't come back. Instead, a different man entered my cell, older, better dressed, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the concrete room. He carried a briefcase and had the bearing of someone used to making decisions rather than following orders. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "I'm sorry you've had such a difficult few days. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about your situation here." I stared at him, too exhausted to speak. "According to our medical evaluation, you've suffered a severe nervous breakdown due to the stress of classified government work," he continued, opening his briefcase and pulling out a folder. The disorientation, the confusion, the stories about finding secret passages, these are all symptoms of acute psychological distress. He showed me an official-looking document with government letterhead. You've been recommended for immediate medical discharge and return to civilian life. Your service record will reflect that you completed your assignment satisfactorily, but required treatment for stress-related health issues. A medic entered the room carrying a syringe filled with clear liquid. The man in the suit nodded, and I felt the needle go into my arm before I could react. "This will help with the anxiety and confusion," the suit said, his voice already starting to sound distant. "You'll feel much better once you've had some rest." The drug hit me like a sledgehammer. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a windstorm, and the room began spinning around me. I tried to speak, to ask about Warren and Teddy, but my tongue felt thick and useless in my mouth. "Sleep now, Mr. Mitchell," the man said, his face fading in and out of focus. "When you wake up, you'll be home in Iowa. This will all seem like a bad dream." The last thing I remembered was being lifted onto a stretcher, the concrete ceiling sliding past overhead as they wheeled me out of the room. Then darkness took me, and I fell into a chemical sleep that lasted for what felt like years. When I finally woke up, I was in a hospital bed in Des Moines, with discharge papers that said I'd successfully completed a classified government assignment, but needed medical treatment for exhaustion and stress. My parents were there, worried but proud, talking about how hard I'd worked for my country. Nobody mentioned Warren Peterson or Teddy Hughes. According to my official records, I'd served alone. The hospital discharge papers felt surreal in my hands as I sat in my childhood bedroom back in Iowa, trying to make sense of what had happened to me. 3 weeks had passed since I'd woken up in that sterile room in Des Moines, and my parents had been nothing but supportive, proud of their son who had served his country in some important but classified capacity. They asked no probing questions about the details, accepting the official explanation that I'd worked too hard and needed rest. But I knew the truth. Every night, fragments of memory pierced through the chemical fog they'd used to scramble my thoughts. Flashes of Warren's terrified face as that thing dragged him away. The sound of Teddy's arm hitting a metal table. The irregular thump-drag footsteps in that underground corridor. The drugs had left gaps in my recollection, entire conversations and details that slipped away whenever I tried to focus on them. But the core horror remained crystal clear. I had to tell someone. The nightmares were eating me alive, and keeping this secret felt like betraying Warren and Teddy all over again. So I drove to the county sheriff's office in Cedar Rapids and asked to speak with someone about a federal crime I'd witnessed. Sheriff Coleman was a decent man who'd known my family for years. He listened patiently as I explained about the research facility, the disappearing recruits, and what I'd found in that basement laboratory. I could see his expression change as I described the creature assembled from human parts, the way it had grabbed Warren, the arm with Teddy's distinctive birthmark. When I finished, Coleman leaned back in his chair and studied me with genuine concern. "Son, I know your folks said you had a rough time with that government work. Sometimes the mind plays tricks when we're under too much stress." He pulled out a file folder and showed me copies of documents I'd never seen before. Medical evaluations from Des Moines General Hospital describing acute psychological distress, paranoid delusions, and recommended treatment for nervous exhaustion. A letter from a Dr. Sarah Chen expressing concern about my mental state and recommending immediate discharge. "These came through official channels, Robert. Says here you were working on some kind of code-breaking project and started seeing things that weren't there. Happens to a lot of smart young people when they push themselves too hard." I tried to explain that Dr. Chen had been part of the facility, that she'd known Teddy was missing when she gave us that false story about his mother. but Coleman had made up his mind. He recommended I speak with a psychiatrist and gave me the name of someone in Iowa City who specialized in stress-related disorders. The psychiatrist was equally dismissive. Dr. Brennan listened to my account with professional detachment, occasionally making notes in a folder that seemed remarkably thick for someone I'd never met before. He asked probing questions about my childhood, my relationship with my parents, any history of mental illness in my family.
The mind has remarkable ways of protecting itself from trauma, he explained after I'd finished. Sometimes, when we're overwhelmed by responsibility or pressure, we create elaborate fantasies to explain our distress. These delusions can feel completely real to the person experiencing them. He prescribed medication for anxiety and recommended weekly sessions to help process what he called my displacement trauma. I took the pills for a few days, but they made me feel disconnected from everything, like I was watching my own life through thick glass. I stopped taking them and canceled my follow-up appointments. I tried contacting the FBI field office in Des Moines, thinking federal agents would be more equipped to handle something of this scope. The agent I spoke with was polite but firm. He explained that they'd already received my medical records and a briefing about my condition from the appropriate authorities. My case had been reviewed and classified as resolved. Mr. Mitchell, I understand you believe you witnessed something disturbing, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Your government service record shows exemplary performance followed by medical discharge due to psychological stress. There's no facility matching your description in Nevada, no project synthesis, no missing persons reports for Warren Peterson or Theodore Hughes. He showed me computer records indicating that Warren Peterson had completed his government service and returned to civilian life in Chicago, where he was reportedly pursuing graduate studies. Theodore Hughes had never been part of any government program, according to their database. I asked to see Warren myself, to speak with him directly. The agent explained that would violate the privacy of someone who had specifically requested no contact with former colleagues due to his own stress-related health issues. Every door I tried to open slammed shut in my face. Phone calls went unreturned. Letters disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Officials who had seemed helpful initially became unavailable when I tried to follow up. It became clear that whoever was behind this had prepared for the possibility that someone might escape and try to expose them. Worse, I started noticing signs that I was being watched. Cars that appeared in my neighborhood for a few days before disappearing. Phone calls where no one spoke after I answered. Men in suits asking my neighbors casual questions about my behavior and mental state. The message was clear. Drop this, or face consequences. The breaking point came 6 months after my return to Iowa. I was working at my father's hardware store, trying to rebuild some kind of normal life, when 2 men in federal identification approached me during my lunch break. They didn't threaten me directly. Instead, they mentioned how concerned they were about my ongoing stress symptoms, how important it was that I continue receiving proper medical treatment. They also mentioned my parents, how proud they were of my service, how much they deserved to enjoy their retirement years in peace, how tragic it would be if anything happened to disrupt their quiet lives in this small Iowa community. I understood. Fighting this would put my family at risk, and I'd already seen what these people were capable of doing to protect their secrets. Warren and Teddy were gone, and bringing them back wouldn't undo what had happened to them. All I could do was try to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my life. I enrolled at the University of Iowa Law School that fall. Legal education seemed like the best path forward for someone who needed to understand how power really worked in America. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I'd once applied to psychological analysis, graduating near the top of my class 3 years later. My law degree opened doors in Washington, D.C.,
where I found work as a junior attorney in the Department of Justice. The irony wasn't lost on me, working for the same government that had destroyed my friends and tried to destroy me. But I'd learned that you couldn't fight the system from outside. Real change required access, influence, and patience. I kept my head down, did excellent work, and slowly gained the trust of my superiors. My background in psychology proved valuable in cases involving national security and classified information. I demonstrated complete discretion about sensitive matters, never discussing my work outside the office, never asking questions that went beyond my clearance level. Over the following decades, I moved between different agencies and departments, accumulating experience, contacts, and security clearances. Justice Department to State Department to Defense Department, and back again. Each position brought greater access to classified information and decision-making processes. My colleagues saw me as reliable, professional, and completely trustworthy with the government's most sensitive secrets. They had no idea how much I already knew about the government's capacity for evil. It was during my second tour at the Defense Department, 15 years after Nevada, that I first encountered a document marked Project Synthesis. I was reviewing budget allocations for special operations research when I noticed a line item that caught my attention. Advanced Human Performance Studies, Nevada Research Complex. The funding levels were enormous, suggesting operations far beyond anything I'd witnessed at that desert facility. I used my clearance carefully, following paper trails that led to other classified programs with similarly innocent names: Project Bluebird, MK Ultra, Technical Research Ship. Each one connected to research involving human subjects, behavioral modification, and capabilities enhancement. The picture that emerged was staggering in its scope and brutality. Project Synthesis had been running since 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. The initial research had focused on captured German and Japanese scientists who'd conducted human experiments during the war. Instead of prosecuting these war criminals, the American government had recruited them to continue their work under new management. The Nevada facility where I'd been taken was just one of dozens scattered across the country. Underground laboratories in military bases, remote research stations in national forests, even facilities hidden beneath major universities. Each one specialized in different aspects of human experimentation: genetic modification, psychological conditioning, surgical enhancement, consciousness transfer. The recruits they'd gathered weren't just cover stories for missing test subjects. They were potential assets being evaluated for different roles within the larger program. Some became test subjects like Teddy. Others, like Warren, provided raw materials for more advanced research. A few, like myself, were assessed for their ability to maintain secrets and operate within the legitimate government structure. My survival hadn't been an accident. They'd let me escape because they'd already determined I could be more useful as an insider than as an experimental subject. The interrogation, the drugs, the cover story, all of it had been designed to test my resilience and discretion. I'd passed their evaluation without even realizing I was being tested. The scope of what I discovered made my own experience seem insignificant. Thousands of young people had disappeared into Project Synthesis over the decades. Brilliant students recruited from universities across the country, told they were serving their nation, then fed into a machine designed to push the boundaries of human biology and psychology. The few who survived the experiments were kept in secure facilities, their modifications studied and refined for future applications. Warren Peterson's name appeared in several documents I found, always referred to by a numerical designation rather than his actual identity. Subject 1127 had provided valuable neurological tissue for consciousness transfer research. His brain had been removed and sectioned for study, while his other organs were harvested for surgical enhancement projects. He'd lived for 3 weeks after his capture, conscious and aware as they systematically dismantled him. The clinical language of the reports couldn't hide the horror of what they'd done to my friend. Warren had died slowly, piece by piece, while scientists documented every aspect of his suffering for the advancement of their research. He'd probably called out for help, for me to save him, right up until they removed his vocal cords for a separate study. I found similar records for dozens of other recruits I remembered from the facility, each one reduced to a series of data points and tissue samples, their individual personalities and dreams stripped away along with their humanity. The program had refined its techniques significantly since 1957, moving beyond crude surgical experiments to more sophisticated genetic manipulation and biological enhancement. But the core mission remained unchanged: determine the limits of human endurance, capability, and modification. Push those boundaries regardless of the cost in human suffering. Apply the results to create enhanced soldiers, improved intelligence assets, and advanced weapon systems that could give America decisive advantages over its enemies. The most disturbing discovery was how integrated Project Synthesis had become with legitimate government operations. Research conducted on unwilling subjects was routinely applied to military training programs, intelligence operations, and even civilian medical applications. Techniques developed through torture and murder were being used to improve the lives of ordinary Americans who had no idea of their origins. I was complicit in all of it. Every day I went to work, every document I reviewed, every decision I participated in, all of it helped maintain the system that had killed Warren and Teddy and thousands of others. My silence was part of the cover-up, my discretion another layer of protection for the people responsible. But I also realized that speaking out would accomplish nothing except my own destruction. The evidence I'd found would disappear, my access would be revoked, and I'd end up as another casualty of a program designed to eliminate threats to its existence. The only way to honor Warren and Teddy was to survive long enough to find a real opportunity to expose the truth. So I continued my career, rising through the ranks, gaining trust and access, while documenting everything I could about Project Synthesis and its successor programs. I became the perfect government insider, knowledgeable, discreet, and completely reliable. My colleagues never suspected that I was memorizing every detail, waiting for the right moment to reveal what our government had been doing in the shadows for decades. That moment wouldn't come for another 40 years. But when it did, I would be ready to tell the world about Warren Peterson, Teddy Hughes, and all the others whose names had been erased from official records, but whose deaths deserved to be remembered. I paused the recording and sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of everything I'd just spoken into existence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same sterile sound that had followed me through decades of government offices, each one hiding its own collection of classified horrors behind beige walls and security clearances. My throat felt raw from talking for so long. The cancer had spread to my lymph nodes months ago, making swallowing difficult and speaking painful after extended periods. But I'd needed to get it all out. Every detail I could remember about Warren and Teddy and that nightmare facility in Nevada. The irony wasn't lost on me that my cancer was probably another gift from Project Synthesis. The chemical exposure during those few days underground had been brief but intense, and I'd spent 40 years wondering when the bill would come due. Other veterans of government chemical testing programs had developed similar cancers decades after their exposure. Agent Orange, nuclear fallout, experimental drugs. The government had a long history of poisoning its own people and then denying responsibility. I was just another casualty in a war most Americans didn't even know was being fought. The program had evolved far beyond what I'd witnessed in 1957. During my decades working within the system, I'd caught glimpses of how sophisticated the research had become.
No more crude surgical experiments like the creature that had taken Warren. The modern iteration focused on genetic manipulation, consciousness transfer, and biological enhancement at the cellular level. They could achieve the same results without leaving obvious scars or creating obvious monsters. The test subjects still disappeared, but now they were replaced with perfect duplicates who returned to their families with altered memories and modified biology. Parents never knew their children had been swapped out for enhanced versions. Spouses lived with partners whose personalities had been chemically adjusted or whose bodies contained experimental implants. The replacements were so convincing that even close family members couldn't detect the difference. I'd learned about these improvements through budget reviews, personnel files, and research summaries that crossed my desk over the years. Never enough information to understand the full scope, but sufficient details to recognize that Project Synthesis had become something far more sophisticated and terrifying than what I'd encountered as a young man. The worst part was how normalized it had all become. These programs operated with the same bureaucratic efficiency as any other government initiative. Committees approved funding allocations. Scientists published internal research papers. Administrators tracked performance metrics and quarterly goals. The systematic violation of human dignity had been transformed into routine paperwork, processed by people who viewed themselves as patriots serving their country. I'd been one of those people for 4 decades. Every document I'd reviewed, every meeting I'd attended, every decision I'd participated in had helped maintain the machinery that consumed innocent lives. My silence had been purchased with career advancement and the illusion of serving a greater good. I'd told myself I was gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. But mostly I'd just been protecting my own position within the system. The recordings I'd made would probably suffer the same fate as my earlier attempts to reveal the truth. Government disinformation campaigns were far more sophisticated now than they'd been in the 1960s. They could discredit testimony, alter documentation, and create alternative narratives that made whistleblowers appear unstable or unreliable. My confession would likely be dismissed as the delusional ramblings of a dying man. Another conspiracy theory from someone who'd spent too much time around classified information.
But there was a chance, however small, that some version of my story might survive. Even if they distorted the details or buried the evidence, fragments of truth had a way of surfacing eventually. Someone might ask the right questions or find the right documents. Future researchers might piece together enough information to understand what had really happened to Warren Peterson and Teddy Hughes and all the others whose names had been erased from official records. Richard Nixon's crimes had been exposed and punished because enough people with access to information decided the truth mattered more than loyalty to the institution. Nixon had resigned in disgrace, faced criminal investigation, and lived the rest of his life with his legacy permanently tainted by Watergate. His co-conspirators had gone to prison. The system had demonstrated it could hold powerful people accountable when their crimes became undeniable. But the architects of Project Synthesis continued their work in shadow, protected by classification levels that placed them beyond public scrutiny. They faced no congressional investigations, no criminal prosecutions, no media exposure that might threaten their operations. Their names appeared on no public documents. Their budgets were hidden within larger allocations for legitimate research. They operated with complete impunity because their crimes were too secret to prosecute and too horrible for most people to believe. Nixon had been a small-time crook compared to the people who'd turned human experimentation into a routine government function. His worst offense had been obstructing justice to cover up a political scandal. These individuals had orchestrated the systematic torture and murder of thousands of American citizens, then built their entire careers on the knowledge gained from those atrocities. I reached over and stopped the recording device, the red light finally going dark after hours of confession.
The silence in my office felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the truth I'd spoken had changed the molecular composition of the air itself. My hands shook as I removed the digital storage card from the recorder. The tremors were getting worse as the cancer progressed, making simple tasks increasingly difficult. But I managed to insert the card into an envelope along with a handwritten letter explaining the context of the recording. Jennifer Walsh was the only journalist I trusted to handle this responsibly. She'd spent 20 years investigating government cover-ups and had the contacts necessary to verify information through independent sources. Her previous work on CIA domestic surveillance programs had demonstrated both her commitment to accuracy and her ability to protect sources from retaliation. If anyone could find a way to tell this story safely, it would be her. I wrote her address on the envelope in careful block letters, double-checking each line to ensure there were no mistakes. The Postal Service would deliver this tomorrow, assuming my deteriorating health allowed me to make it to the mailbox downstairs. If not, my assistant would find the envelope among my personal effects and hopefully follow the delivery instructions I'd included. The confession felt incomplete without photographs or documentation, but I'd learned long ago that physical evidence had a way of disappearing when it threatened powerful interests. My testimony alone might not be enough to convince skeptics, but it would provide a starting point for investigators willing to dig deeper into the classified world where these crimes had been committed. I sealed the envelope and placed it carefully in my briefcase, then sat back in my chair to wait for the end. The cancer would take me within days now, the doctors had confirmed. The pain medication was becoming less effective, and my appetite had disappeared completely. I'd lost 40 pounds in the past 2 months, my body consuming itself as the disease spread through my organs.
But I'd finally told the truth about Warren Peterson and Teddy Hughes and the countless others who had disappeared into the government's secret laboratories. Their names would survive in my testimony, even if their bodies had been reduced to research data decades ago. Someone would remember that they'd been brilliant young men with futures stolen from them, not just anonymous test subjects in classified experiments. That had to be enough. Warren had screamed at me to run, to save myself, as that creature dragged him back toward the laboratory. I'd spent 67 years running from what I'd witnessed, but now I'd finally stopped and turned around to face the truth. My friends deserved that much at least. The confession was done. All that remained was to deliver it and wait for whatever came next.